There we go. Welcome. So a huge welcome. Sorry, we're 1 minute late. We've had a couple of last-minute shuffles going on. So a huge welcome to you for joining us. I'm Ed Davis. I'm the Policy Director here at the Centre for Social Justice. Hopefully you're logging on hoping to hear about employment and jobs in the future. If you're not hoping, then welcome anyway. A bit of housekeeping first. We're not planning on any IT glitches here, but we are monitoring and we have backups. So everything does happen, we're on it. But from your end, do refresh your browser if anything happens, just in case it's at your end. We're planning to hear from our 4 panelists over the next hour, about 5 minutes each. But we're really hopeful this will be a good interactive session as well. So there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please do put your questions in there. And I will field them to our panelists in the Q&A section of this. Keep them brief and do point to who you'd like to answer them if you have particular queries. So talking of our panelists, I should introduce them. Thank you, firstly, Mims Davis for joining at the very last minute. Therese Coffey was going to join us and has an urgent meeting. So Mims has been thrown under the bus and thrown to the wolves here to come and join us. So thank you very much for that. We'll give you a few minutes to get your papers in order, so Mims will go last. But then we're also very pleased with the rest of our panel as well. So Nick Fletcher, MP, MP for Don Valley, great to have you here. Nick is one of the 2019 intakes from the infamous Once Red, Now Blue Wall, but also comes with a really good, interesting experience of having actually been an employer as well, which is going to be so important going forward. And interesting, actually, Nick has done some really interesting different work on role models in his constituency, which I would really advocate if you haven't seen. But in the future, while we're looking particularly at youth unemployment as well, that kind of work could become even more significant. So welcome, Nick. Then we'll be hearing from Mercy Maroki, the CSJ's own Mercy. So Mercy has been working on our universal credit work recently, particularly looking at universal support, which is the sort of personalised support side of people on the welfare system, and looking how we can really give rocket boosters to that and make that work well. And she also comes with personal experience of having moved from universal credit into work, so has an interesting personal story to tell here about how it worked for her as well. And then Ian Duncan Smith hopefully doesn't need too much introduction. He's the founder and chairman of the Centre for Social Justice, and also has his 6 years experience as Secretary of State in the DWP, as well as a former leader of the Conservative Party. So thank you to our 4 panelists for joining. Just before I hand over to you all, just a quick scene setter from me. I won't speak for too long, that's not what people logged on for. The CSJ is a poverty think tank, and we talk about our 5 pathways to poverty, about addiction and about debt, about education, family breakdown and worklessness. But worklessness runs through every single piece of work we do. It's fair to say that it's very hard to recover from addiction without a job. It is very hard to get yourself out of debt without a job. It is very hard to do anything in life if you do not have that income, but not just income, but that purpose and dignity and identity that comes with work. And so seeing the alarm bells starting to ring around this issue is really concerning to us. So we're really pleased that we could run this event and start talking through some of these problems today. I think it's not just going to be a government effort either to recreate the jobs miracle, as it's referred to over the last few years. It's going to be about businesses, it's going to be about local communities, and for people falling out of work, the DWP has a really significant role, which is why it's great that Mims could join us. And I think yesterday we just heard about the JET scheme that's been launched, which is, sadly, it sounded like something from Top Gun, but it is in fact the Job Entry Targeted Support Scheme, which is slightly different, but actually far more important than Top Gun, obviously. And so initiatives like that over the months and year ahead is going to be really, really important. So a great panel, a really important topic, and really timely with what's going on at the moment. But if I could hand over to Nick first to lay out the scene as you see it in your constituency through your work and what you're seeing on the ground. Over to you, Nick.
Yes, thank you for that. It's a tough time. There's no 2 ways about it. It's a tough time for every sector. Every sector's being hit. My inbox is full of people with a myriad of different issues, but to one central theme is COVID and the way that it's affecting their lives. This meeting's what can the government do to protect the labour market, and obviously that is a crucial issue and a crucial question. I do think we need to start with a little bit of praise for the government first off. I think they have done a tremendous job. I think what the Treasury have done over the past 6 months has been absolutely phenomenal. My business, I'm an electrical contractor. At the start of COVID, I was employing 38 people. Many of them were apprentices, and we was fortunate at the start of coronavirus. We were classed as key workers. I had to put an awful lot of things in place so that the employees were safe, but we did actually continue to work through that. Having said that, we've come to an end of a contract somewhere in July, and then we've hit COVID. So we sort of hit it 3 months after lots of other people did. So the furlough scheme has been fantastic. It really has. And the way that the scheme worked, if I ever had any questions from constituents, I'd just speak to my accountant and I'll say, how do we do this? And she would literally tell me. So literally boots on the ground telling me exactly how these systems are working and what flaws there were. And in all honesty, with the furlough scheme, it worked seamlessly. It was absolutely an amazing scheme. We still have, I believe my firm still got 5 people on furlough, but the job support scheme that's coming out in the 1st of November, we will, as much as possible, share the work out between other people. So that is another fantastic scheme. I've heard people say that it's expensive to do that, and I understand that some people might think that way. But I employ a lot of staff that have been with me for many, many years, and really well trained staff, and so I want to keep those staff. So although it will cost me in the short term, I think it's something that it's worthwhile doing. So it's the relationship between the employer and the employees, the skills that will make that scheme worthwhile or not so much. Obviously, there will be people that lose their jobs, and I've always said, other than your health, if you've got good health, that's wonderful. But the next thing is your job. It's so important. And as an employer, I've not had to let too many people go in my 26 years, but I have had to let a few. And to sit in front of the breadwinner of a house and tell them that they're going to lose the job is an awful thing to do, because you know that they've got to go home and tell their family the same thing. And I would imagine there's an awful lot of people out there who feel like they're letting the family down when that happens. And I think it's really, really important that employers speak really carefully to their employees and understand what they're actually going through, because I think it's really difficult. I mean, I set up my business 26 years ago because I was made redundant. And it was a Conservative scheme that put me back on the road, as it were. I was made redundant at 21 years old as an electrician from Doncaster Plant Works. We were rewiring the London Underground trains. The contract finished, and we were made redundant. And it was an awful feeling. But it was a Conservative initiative. Syrian might remember it, an employment scheme. We was sent on a course. It was the dole then, as it was called, and I was £10 a week for 6 weeks to go on a business course. And then at the end of that business course, you created a business plan, and then you had £40 a week for the first year of your business. And that's how I started my business. So anyone asks why I joined the Conservative Party, that's the reason why. I mean, it was a wonderful scheme, and it worked out. And it didn't work out for everybody, but I think if you put the effort in, you put the time in, you don't expect too much in the first few years, and you keep your head down, you do a good job, then success is there. It just sometimes takes a bit of getting to. So I think the government have done some wonderful stuff. I think the Kickstart scheme will help. The lifetime skills is another wonderful thing. There's an awful lot. Don Valley itself has got quite a number of people who are in the later on in the 30s, 40s who have not done so well at school and fell into a job that they've just stayed with. And I think now's the time for change. I think people need to realise that some jobs they may not get back. Some sectors may not come back as strong as they ever did. They may come back slightly different. And so instead of thinking, my job's gone, there's nothing I can do about it, I think maybe the retraining and the Kickstart should really help people move along. So I hope that's enough of a brief to start off with. Brilliant.
Thank you, Nick. Really helpful and really good to hear actually what's going on in real businesses out in the real world at the moment, have that perspective on this. Just a reminder to people listening in, if you have questions on anything Nick said, do put them in the Q&A and we'll come to them later. Move on to Mercy next, if I may. Mercy, who is thinking now of people who maybe have come out of work and are on universal credit. You have experience of that. You've been working on it as well at the CSJ. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so as you say, I have personal experience of universal credit. I first moved on to universal credit when I started university, and ordinarily students aren't eligible for universal credit, but I was a single parent and I was starting a full-time course, and my rent alone, I'd moved to London, was £1,200 a month. And obviously my student finance would not cover anywhere near that, just for rent alone. So I went on to universal credit, and for me it really was a lifeline, and there'll be hundreds of thousands of people who are now going on to universal credit who will very much be feeling the same way as I did, that they now have this lifeline. As of July this year, there's nearly 6 million people on universal credit. So the system is very much supporting, a huge number of people. And my personal thoughts on the system is that it is a streamlined system. I found it when I went on it. It was clear, it was easy to understand, and what's kind of central to universal credit is that it is made very clear from the beginning that it's kind of a contract between yourself and essentially the state, because you're made to sign this claimant agreement, and it is made clear that this is kind of a transitional arrangement, a transitional period, so that you kind of fulfill your duties, you do your best to get into employment, and in exchange the government gives you a lifeline. And so for me, universal credit, I hold it in very high esteem, and I'm confident that it is kind of fit for purpose as it is. Of course, there's been criticism of universal credit, and it has gotten a bad rap over the years, not least because of things like the 5-week wait, although there are the advanced payment system does kind of mitigate the negative effects that 5-week wait might have. And there are trickier issues that people might encounter when moving onto universal credit, having lost their job. So it's paid in arrears, childcare costs are paid in arrears. So there are gaps in the system where people might find that they kind of don't have enough money in the immediate term, because they kind of have to wait to make up for their losses. And I think there's definitely scope for the government to smooth out those transitions in various ways to make moving onto universal credit easier, because moving out of universal credit onto work is quite a clear process once you have a job. Because it's the taper rate is quite clear. So for every £1 you earn, I think it's still 63 pence you have taken off. So it is very much a smooth transition out of work. And I don't think people realise actually how fit for purpose it is, because it has gotten criticism over the years, and 81%, it has an 81% satisfaction rate, which is incredibly high, and that goes up to 94% for people over 75, for instance. And for comparison, if you look at the UK customer satisfaction index, that is actually higher than any other sector in the economy as far as satisfaction goes. So it is a system that works, and 98% of all claims are paid on time and in full. So I think we don't have anything much to worry about in terms of whether universal credit as a system is going to be enough to support people who are unemployed, support them getting into work. I have concerns, though, about particular cohorts of people who were already struggling before the pandemic. And before the pandemic, up to a third of people who are on universal credit had never worked before. A lot of them were struggling to pay bills, and there are people, I think Ree and Ten say they have difficulty even kind of using the digital system in the first place. So what I worry about is that there's going to be a lot of people now who are going to be pushed into more vulnerability because of the problems they've experienced as a result of COVID. So mental health issues, isolation issues, addiction issues, debt issues. COVID is inevitably going to exacerbate a lot of those problems, which means that a lot of people are going to need actually support. That universal credit in and of itself and getting a paycheck at the end of every month won't kind of be enough to address those more complex and multiple issues. And at the CSJ, we're obviously looking into this, and we're publishing a paper soon for universal support, which is something that Ed mentioned at the start. And universal support is kind of a wraparound system which tries to help people who are suffering multiple and complex needs. And these are economic, social, mental, physical needs, not just kind of helping somebody get a job at the end of it. And I think it's kind of more important now than ever before that we're supporting people with those complex needs, because it's inevitably going to be a bigger group than ever before, suffering all these issues that kind of stop them from being able to transition into the workplace again. And universal support, it has been tried before, and locally, universal support delivered locally a few years ago, and it had positive results. And what I would hope the government would do is to invest in a universal support program again, because if we don't kind of acknowledge that actually the problems that people face are more than just financial, there is actually a range of social, physical and mental problems, and those need to be tackled in conjunction with the financial problems they face. I think that kind of holistic system that looks at the individual and tailors support in that way is what's really going to be needed in this COVID era.
Brilliant, thank you, Mercy. I think that statistic that you raised there, that a third of people before the pandemic had never worked. They're still out there, they still haven't worked, and that's a really sort of salutary point, I think. Thank you for that, really interesting. Let's move on to someone who is very familiar with the universal credit system after 6 years in Department of Work and Pensions. Right Honourable Sir Ian Duncan-Smith. You're on mute. I'm so glad I got to say that.
I thought you guys had the power to mute and unmute, but as chairman, I was reviewing your contract. Anyway, moving on from there. First of all, it's very good to be here at this completely dislocated conference. I must say, I'm sure many other people watching this can find it very difficult to work up the usual enthusiasm when speakers are standing in front of you or to get involved, but given everything else that's going on, at least we are pressing on with this. So welcome to all those. I think there are well over 40 people watching this at the moment, give or take. So welcome to all of you. Just two things very quickly. When I set up the Centre for Social Justice, I set it up because, as Ed said earlier on, it was to deal with what I call the root causes of poverty. That is to say, if you look at the the left, the Labour Party's view of this a lot of the time, they want to talk about the absence of money. And while the absence of money is a definer of poverty, it doesn't tell you very much else about the family or the individual's condition as to how they got there, why they're there, how they can't get out. Lots of people fall into poverty, but do so briefly. Sometimes, for example, people going through a bad divorce, a woman maybe in her 30s or even in her 40s or whatever, terrible time, falls into poverty because, you know, she at that stage doesn't have the earnings, etc. But she may have skills. She may have skills such as a degree, or she may have been in work before and then chosen to stay at home with the kids, but she has some skills. So just reading across that her problem is poverty doesn't tell you anything about her, and that with a little bit of assistance, she'll be able to get herself up and out of poverty because of the skills she's got and retraining and anything else, as opposed to somebody else that comes from a family which has historically failed at education, may have problems of drug and alcohol abuse, and themselves, their children, are therefore bumping along at the bottom, maybe with abuse, etc. So the path for those is going to stay under the line. So you need to know what you have to do for a group like that. And that I want to come back to with universal support, which Mercy touched on. So when we set up the CSJ, it was to look at those 5 pathways and to say, are you part of that? And therefore, how do we deal with you, rather than just try and figure out whether you are simply all in the same bucket, because most people are not. And that brings me on to universal credit. The point about universal credit, which we originally designed, I led the team at the time that was doing it at the Centre for Social Justice long before I got into government, was because we realized that one of the great stumbling blocks for people getting back into work was the complexity of the benefit system. The reality that you had to go and make claims for housing benefit, for job seekers allowance. Once you'd been at job seekers allowance and you got back into work, even if it was only for 12 hours, you left job seekers allowance and then you went on to the tax credit model, which at the same time, working tax credit was fine, except you never went and saw anybody. You had to do it disembodied. The websites didn't really work very well, and you had to do it mostly by telephone. You had no advice, no experience at all, and then you had to manage all of that. And if you failed to notify them of any particular payments, then I used to see endless numbers of people coming into my constituency office saying that they were now finding they had a bill at the end of the year for £5,000 or £10,000 that they had to repay because they were overpaid, because they didn't tell them that they were doing more hours, and therefore they hadn't been able to make the calculation. So universal credit was to bring those 6 benefits that impinged on this and to bring them all together so that when you make a claim, you make one claim. That means, therefore, everything is calculated and dealt with. So it simplifies the system. It does more than that, though. It makes it more automatic. So, for example, when you're in work, it's really worth reminding everybody that you don't now get penalized for failing to tell an office that your hours went up, because a month in arrears, if your hours went up, it will deal with those because you now have an automatic payment system that reminds universal credit that you're now doing more hours. The next month, you'll have, therefore, a lower level of universal credit. If you crash out of work, you don't have to make another claim for housing benefit because it's all in the one claim. Many people are put off going back into work ever again because housing benefit run locally could take 2 or 3 months sometimes to get paid to them, and they were lying unable to pay their rent, often getting evicted, no fault of their own. It's just that the system couldn't cope. So simplifying it is a major breakthrough. The second part of it is making it easy to claim online has proved itself, I think, in this pandemic. Imagine what would have happened had we had the other systems as your first point of entry. There would have been queues going not just round the block, but down the road and out of the town as people panicked, standing 2 meters apart from each other and waiting to get in line. The miserable time they'd have spent, rather like those supermarket queues at the beginning. And the reality is they haven't had to do that, which has meant that we didn't have any problems with the COVID transmission. And better than that, it meant that the DWP could manage the process. Now, the DWP have done magnificently, and I say that with MIMS here, because I know the system very well. They put 10,000 extra staff into running it when they realized the huge demand. And the beauty of DWP, probably better than any other department, I say this with a bit of pride, better than any department in government, and I say that without any fear of contradiction, is that everybody in the DWP has to go what they call to the floor, which means they have to do time being in a job center, which means that no matter how high or mighty they are, at some point, if the call for those 10,000 people came, they drop what they're doing and they can go and run a benefit system. And that is peculiarly practical. And it's also brilliantly retail, which means that they are an organization that is, I think, the most efficient in government. And that's because they have to be, because if they fail to make a payment, somebody is in deep trouble. So all of that lends itself to the running of UC. And I congratulate the department for having made sure that it works. But the fact is the structure was right. But Mercy touched on this earlier on, which is I didn't design UC to stand alone. Myself and David Freud, who was the minister from the House of Lords at the time, we worked a system called universal support. The reason why, Mercy touched on a point that said that there are a group of people that struggle and have always struggled, and UC identifies them exactly. The point about universal credit is more than just a payment system. It's deliberately there to identify those with the greatest problems. And that's not a failing, that's a positive. Why? Because it means that the universal support system that we designed allows you, once you've identified them, what you have to do with universal credit, which should happen, is you move them, those most vulnerable, into another program of support. So if they have debt problems, you want to be bringing them into debt counseling, because nobody with debt is going to stay in work for very long. If they have drug and alcohol problems, you need to get them onto those programs to get them off. Otherwise, their families are going to suffer. The money is going to go into the wrong place. You can see all of these things that we need to do. But what's missing at the moment, not dramatically, because lots of other bodies, charities do this work, but universal support needs now to park alongside universal credit to complete the process, which allows then the job center staff to be able to say, right, this one's got a problem. They've got a history of bad debt. They're not going to go straight into work. We need to move them across onto a program. There they would work with local government, local charities, the Citizens Advice Bureau. All of these organizations would come together, because universal credit was always meant to be about remediation. It was not a benefit system. It was about changing people's lives. And with universal support, that should be its ambition, to change people's lives. And right now, as the government gets into this difficulty of more people unemployed, I do heavily recommend, as Mercy has, that the paper that we're producing, it's produced, actually does deal with that. And I recommend to MIMS, I've sent it to the Chancellor and I should be talking to him later, but also to raise that you do need to look at this. Now is the time to do it, because you are going to deal with these difficult bodies. And two other points I would say are important. Go back to the work program. If you get long-term unemployed, the work program that we put in place, which used the private and the voluntary sector, was so successful that the Public Accounts Committee said it was the most effective back to work program, most cost effective back to work program that has ever been invented. We shut it down because we had no more long-term unemployed, or not enough to put through the system. But I do recommend, MIMS, again, that you have another good look at that, because that was the key. And the final point I'd say is we brought in work experience programs. I know you're doing that at the moment, but for young kids that had got onto the benefit system for the first time, but couldn't get a job because they had no experience, we gave them 3 months on welfare, but they could go and work in a company. So we paid the welfare to them and they got work experience. And over 60% of them went straight back into work after that. So that's an area you might want to look at. But we're now going to be faced with the biggest challenge we've ever had. It was bad enough after the last economic crash, but I think this is going to be worse. It's going to be worse because much of this furlough scheme is now supporting companies and people who no longer really have a job. And as that goes, they will cascade onto universal credit. The beauty of universal credit, it's there to support them in low hours as well. But the point about it is that you're going to need that extra support. And so whilst it's going to be difficult, I think that the key here is to get the economy moving. And we can talk more about that. But when you look at what the government has got, what they're doing, what we have as a country, when it comes to people falling out of work, I think we now have the best systems in the world for making sure they're supported. They can be added to, they can be improved, but as systems, I think they work better than anything else that I've seen, and I therefore congratulate the government for their hard work on it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Ian. I suppose sort of the quote from that to pick up is that we now have the biggest challenge we've ever had. I suppose the question is, who would be an employment minister? And so I'm glad we've got one. I think, as Ian said, the DWP has actually been one of the unsung heroes of the last 6 months, preventing queues around the block. It'd be great to hear a bit about that, and also where you see the future going, Mims.
Yeah, who really would be an employment minister right now? And I must say, in January, I had a meeting with my team looking at the labour market, and it was exactly as Mercy spoke about. It was those people who consistently had the barriers, who hadn't seen the benefits of the impressive jobs miracle, the fact that 45 years plus had gone by and we hadn't seen such amazing labour market figures, but it was those people that still seem to have the barriers. And I was the sports minister before, so it's no picnic here or there right now. But when the Prime Minister called me and asked me to do a different job, what he said to me is, Mims, you care about equality, you care about opportunity and progression, particularly around the women's agenda, and gave me a wonderful sell. And at the end of it, he said, I want you to move to DWP. And actually, it was throwing down the gauntlet to exactly those challenges that Mercy described. So I think we're very aware that people who were left behind before this pandemic are afraid still potentially there, and that's something that the Secretary of State, and I'm afraid she can't be here, and I apologise for that. So I have been subbed very late, but the progression agenda, resilience agenda is really important to her and me as well, and we'll continue to work with that hand in hand with what we're doing, with what's in front of us. And I think we heard from Nick regarding the handbrake on the economy in terms of up and down the land, and actually what this means to a particular company, what this means to particular livelihoods. And I think this is one thing that at DWP we really understand. This is about people's livelihoods, people's pay packets, and how people feel. And we heard some of the benefits of being in work, and one thing that we do know is if you're already in work, you're much more confident and much more able to take yourself on to the next stage. And the challenge with the furlough unwinding and the impact of COVID is, how do we keep people close to that labour market, and how do we get them onto that next stage and make sure that people aren't left behind? So there's no doubt 2020 has been a challenge for us all. And I go back to that meeting in January when I said, you know, that thing that's happening in China, do you think it could affect our labour market? And my officials do remind me of that. But we are really getting on with things, and I do want to address the question here, and that is, what could the government do more to protect the labour market in 2020? And what we have heard is around the furlough scheme. We've got the new winter economy plan, we've heard about JETS, and we've got more coming in our job finding support service. But Kickstart has been incredibly important. I spent most of my summer working on this policy, and it is hugely ambitious for our young people. And actually, it's our young people that we really do not want to get left behind. And that's something the Prime Minister made very clear to me coming into this role as well. So alongside Kickstart, we've got our new youth hubs and our broader youth offer at DWP. And I just want to pay tribute to Sir Ian, because he's absolutely right. Operations and job centres comes under me. And can you imagine people with their rent agreements, with their personal documents, all in the street waiting to try and register in this situation? Be simply impossible, and actually another public health challenge. And if we think about our own frontline workers, our frontline workers have been absolutely brilliant. At one particular figure that jumps out to me is 27,000 extra hours were worked just over the Easter bank holiday weekend by people in DWP, making sure that people newly on universal credit were paid in a timely fashion, and using the digital and telephony, moving to a more flexible way of engaging with people, which is what we wanted to do coming into this. We really stepped up to that, and I must pay huge tribute to Therese and all of our civil service servants and everybody who's worked incredibly hard to lead the way at DWP. And what it's left is a really confident group of ministers and also civil servants who are absolutely determined to take on the next stage, which is the challenge to the labour market. So we know the bottom line here is that you're better off in work. If you can work, we want you to work. All the reasons have been outlined earlier. And we've got some really complex challenges, and that's why we've got Kickstart. So that's 6 months, an opportunity to be employed, more businesses involved than you ever had in the Future Jobs Fund. We've had thousands of jobs already committed. Our first placements have been advertised today. They start in November. And I would say to anybody who's watching, you can apply up to next December for a Kickstarter. And the reason that we've set it up the way that we have is because going back to the point earlier about recovery, it's going to be really important that we're having a locally led recovery where we've got local lockdowns of further impacts or particular sectors that are impacted. That's where we want to be working with our LEPs, our mayors, with our councils, so that we have everybody working to the same objective, which is to get back to where we were before this in January, but also to recover and build back better, as you know very clearly from the slogan, but also because that's what constituents and people want in terms of a green recovery and to take the positives out of this. And also, I think as the employment minister, we know that there were some structural issues in the labour market, whether it's an ageing challenge in construction, not enough diversity, still challenges attracting people into care or agriculture, not enough people with digital skills. That's why our answer has to be in the plan for jobs across departments to make sure that those skills, upskills and that confidence is there. And as we heard from Nick as well, you know, there are going to be people who just simply didn't expect their sector to grind to a halt. They didn't expect to be getting those messages, and we need to make sure that we pick people up, give them support onto the next stage. So this is really, really important to get right. So we're going to be doubling the number of our work coaches, 13,500. We should have around another 4,500 coming in November, additional job centres. And I'll be very honest, I do not want to be the employment minister that has more job centres, but the fact is we've got more claimants. It gives us a chance to refresh our estate and make sure that we've got them in the right place to support those local recoveries. We've expanded the Work in Health programme. That's what JETS has been about, and that launched yesterday. We've got a broader youth offer, as I mentioned earlier. So this is whether you're 16 to 24, that we're working with local colleges, that we're unpicking where to start when it comes to skilling yourself up and knowing what's right for you. If you're on UC, if you've left education, if you're not sure about the opportunities near to you, this is the way that DWP is going to be able to help you. And one thing I would say in all the engagement that I've done with all different sectors around this recovery, listening to younger people's charities and all different business groups, people have been really keen on that local recovery plan, but also they've been really delighted with the flexibility that you see from DWP. And I agree with Sir Ian, all of my private office team have all worked at the coalface, and they continue to be, and they're absolutely our eyes and ears. So we've got people who work in the service centres, who've been decision makers, who've worked in all different types of job centres, whether it's coastal, whether it's central London, whether it's rural. So we really understand what our claimants' challenges are, and so that's been really, really important, and that I think really is a credit to DWP, and it helps you make better decisions. One thing Therese and I have also been doing is regular monthly meetings with our work coaches, so that we hear from both leadership and also people on the ground across the country to find out what the challenges are. So when we're making decisions about what happens with the MIF, we're making decisions for a minimum income floor for those, or the next phase of what the opportunity to set up your own company is with the new enterprise allowance, which is due to be renewed at some point. We're really hearing from people about what those challenges are, and we're making informed decisions, and that we're out at those job centres and those service centres and those youth hubs hearing from people. And I always ask myself, operationally, how does this work? How does this transpire? And I do not want to be making a decision in Westminster that ultimately does not translate if you're in Ynys Môn or if you're in anywhere else. So that really does drive me in terms of this role. So we've got a huge amount of work to do. We're absolutely up for it. And of course, my colleagues who do welfare delivery, or indeed Justin, who's so committed to his section in terms of helping disabled people, and that again is around making sure there's no barriers coming in back into work. We are really focused on making sure that we do everything that we can to not have people left behind when we push into recovery. So hopefully that gives you an overview from me, and it's a pleasure to be here, although a slightly unexpected one.
Very well, thank you for being here. Describe yourselves as substitute. I believe these days we call them finishers or completers or something like that. They're the key people who come on. I'm going to open it up to the audience now to ask questions. They're starting to come in thick and fast. But I want to pitch one first and abuse my position as chair to just come back on something you mentioned there, Mims. I'm really interested to hear about the offer for young people. We do a lot of work with frontline charities, and we've recently gone to them and said, what's your big fear for the future? And youth unemployment was one of the really big ones to come back. And I just wondered, in your work with colleges, what you're seeing coming out of colleges at the moment, are we work ready? Are we bringing work ready students to the fore? Are we working on that? Are they ready for the construction industry, as you say, that's getting older, we need young people? What does that look like?
So I think this has been a challenge for schools. I think it's a challenge for employers, if we're really honest. I think it's also a challenge for anybody who wants to reskill about where do you start. So I think coming out of this, if we can get that bit right to help people, is going to be really important. Yeah, young people, absolute passion of mine, having had the youth role previously at DCMS, and I've been working really strongly with the youth section. I hope people, you know, watching now will recognise that actually, in terms of what we're doing for young people, in terms of our offer, there's been really warm reaction to this. So we've been working with the youth employment forums, we've been working with the Prince's Trust, and that's why Kickstart's been developed as well in the way that it has, so particular groups and sectors can come together to offer our young people the opportunities they need. But to your point around colleges, you're absolutely right, and that's why those local recovery plans and working with our local job centres really is important, and that's why that youth hub plan has come together. We're not far off putting together 100 youth hubs across the UK. So whether you're leaving school or college, or if you're 16 and a care leaver, there is a point where we can bring those skills challenges together and we can answer them. The other thing that we've got is our sector-based work academy programme. This is really important, and actually this is for people of any age, but actually if you're a younger person as well, and you've already done Kickstart, or there's something different for you to do, there's a guaranteed interview at the end of an experience of trying out a sector. So recently I went to Kennington, for example. They had people with a retail and logistics background, and they were taking them through the programme of working in logistics in construction. There were guaranteed vacancies at the end. People interviewed for them, and guess what? They moved into that sector. And that's really helping the construction industry, for example, because they've got an ageing workforce and they're trying to appeal to more sectors of the workforce and be more diverse, and also tackle the kind of Dad's Army Brigade challenge. So, you know, that works really well. So we've got a range of tools for our young people. And I would say to people, if you haven't been to a JCP, if you haven't linked in with us, if you're an employer, then you really are missing out. And this is a chance for you to get some great new talent into your company.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to move on to questions from the audience as well now. So the first one comes in from Salim Shafi. This is an interesting one. Maybe, Nick, if I could direct this to you in the first instance. It asks for the panel's views on encouraging a move to a 4-day working week supported by transition support by government akin to the job support scheme. I suppose as a constituency MP and an employer, that would have ramifications. I wonder what you make of that. Yeah,
no, from a personal point of view, I like 5 days a week. I just think that's what we need to. I understand if the work's not there, it's tempting to go to 4 days a week, and I know that may help more people into employment, but I don't think that's that we should be looking at a long-term view. I think busy people are happy people, and I think that's one thing that we should always try and push for. So that's not something that I would particularly recommend, not for a long-term position anyway. Okay. Any other panelists like to come in on that? Ian, you seem to be nodding there. Yeah.
Any attempt by government to define the numbers of days that people can work as a way of sharing it doesn't work. It's one thing that history teaches us. Every time government intervenes in what I call the marketplace, almost always gets it wrong. The truth is, it's down to companies, and particularly the private sector, to create the jobs. The thing I would do is to focus on the cost of running a business right now. You know, if you're a high street business, it's very expensive. Those costs need to come down. Taxation, regulation, those are the areas where you start to get companies then being able to take the marginal costs. And so get the marginal cost off business, they'll create the jobs. They've shown that already. And I think as the economy picks up, we'll do it, but we can't 4-day weeks, no.
I'm going to move on to another one. This is something I know that we've worked on a bit at the CSJ as well. Universal credit is sadly often hamstrung by historical tax credit debt. 30% plus benefit deductions have now resumed. Should ministers look at waiving this debt to strengthen the safety net and right the historical wrong of systemic overpayments in tax credits?
Yeah.
So I suppose you have a view on that.
Let me pick up on that because I was there at the time. First of all, it's invidious, and I'm going to mince my words on this, that universal credit, as people go in, they're forced to carry the tax credit debt across with them. That tax credit debt was there because of the basic incapability of the tax credit system to be able to get itself right. As I said earlier on, there are people that walked to the end of the year and found themselves with big debts which they've never been able to settle. A large chunk of that tax credit too has never been properly collected, nor have they even made any attempt to do it. And if the HMRC were actually looked at properly and had to have what the DWP does, which is a full audit every year, you'd begin to find some things that are really quite interesting. What they did was, as we came across, they insisted that the debt, which had nothing to do with universal credit, was brought across. That debt does put difficulties for people coming onto universal credit for the first time. And I think it's really important that government realizes that this does no good in trying to get people into work. So if they want to get that debt back, they should do it separately. And a lot of it is debt that they've historically never got back. So they should look to write that off. But frankly, using UC as a vehicle only punishes UC for something which they had nothing to do with. And you won't get those debts on universal credit. That's the key bit about it. So time to get rid of it.
And Mims, is there a view from within the DWP on that?
Well, certainly that sits in Will Quince's portfolio, so I wouldn't want to tread on his toes. But one thing I would say is that the benefit of going on to UC this summer and in this spring, as we heard from Ian as we introduce this, about how flexible and supportive it is. And I know that it's been a real challenge to get round the perception that universal credit is bad for you, it doesn't work. So, you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't sit with our department. But for me, we've managed to really change the perception of UC. It really does support and help people. And of course, I'm not going to write any checks to the Treasury here, but I very much understand Ian's point of view. So I will take that to my fellow Minister, Will Quince.
Thank you. And there's another question here which slightly speaks to it, which might be interesting for you, Mercy, to answer, which speaks to the general generosity of universal credit. I wonder what you made of that, both your experience and in your research, where you see it going right and wrong in that area.
Personally, I think the generosity is about right, and that's because of kind of the way the payments are calculated. So with the local, as I said, when I was on universal credit, for example, my rent was £1,200 a month, and that was covered by my local housing rate in the borough I was living in at the time. So I think one of the good things about universal credit, it starts with what you should have. So you have the child allowance, if that's what it's called, the housing allowance, which is calculated by the local housing rate. They calculate kind of the basic that you need to have a standard of living, and then from that point, deductions are made based on what you're earning. And I think that is the right way to go about it, because you know, in theory, at least how much you get should always be at least how much you need to have a decent standard of living. So generosity wise, I'm not sure about there's an urgent need to increase the generosity of universal credit, but I definitely think when deductions and sanctions are brought into the picture, that's where that's where generosity kind of becomes a problem, because people might be kind of crippled with this debt that they're having big chunks of their monthly payments deducted. And I think that's where you're seeing people saying my universal credit is simply not enough. it will be because of things like deduction, sanctions, and of course the benefit cap.
Thank you. I'm going to come with a slightly different question now. This is more on disability and the existing disability employment gap. And there's fears that this is going to get worse as a result of what's happened over the last year. And the question is quite simply, is there any more we can do to stop this crisis from growing? I suppose potentially I should direct that to the Minister first. So Mims.
I think Justin and I are extremely mindful, and it goes back to January when we were looking at a completely different labour market, but things were very much moving in the right direction. We have got the Access to Work scheme, which is fantastic. And Justin is very much continuing to work with the sector to find out what the barriers are. But you're absolutely right, as the labour market gets more tough, if you've got additional barriers, it's going to be potentially more difficult for you. But certainly the feedback that we've had in the kicks, and certainly when I've done engagement also with the sector as well, we're absolutely listening to those concerns as well and keeping a strong eye on that. And what I would say around Kickstart is that people, and I know that people have already been referred potentially onto Kickstart with additional barriers as young people. So I think people are really seeing this as an opportunity, perhaps where they've been helped by the furlough or other government schemes to really give back to the government or their local community. So I'd ask anybody employing to think about what people can do and really focus on that diversity and inclusion within your business, what you can do to support people locally. And it's certainly something when I was doing the G20 with employment and labour market ministers a couple of weeks ago. The other thing is, Sir Ian, they were very envious of UC. So you're absolutely right in your earlier points, but there was a big focus to make sure that inclusion is the heart of our recovery. That was my message to the G20, and that continues to be our focus in the department.
I suppose Ian or Nick, any more to say on that, on the disability side?
Okay, very quickly, whilst we were there, we've managed to get more people with disability into work than at any other time. So one of the great successes of the last few years with the reforms has been that it's therefore been a case that more and more people with disabilities go into work. Part of that was the program that I set up at the time called Disability Confident. Now, one of the things that stops people with disabilities getting into work is the misunderstanding that somehow they have to do all sorts of things that make it really difficult and it causes problems. What Disability Confident does, and I think it's really important to try and push this now, actually the story is the exact opposite, that people with disabilities invariably are more productive, work harder, work longer, and are more likely to stay loyal to the company than those who do not have those disabilities. So the payback is enormous to a company for having somebody with disabilities. So the wrong understanding of what happens can be put right, and therefore the question is not should you take somebody with disabilities. The question is why wouldn't you take somebody with disabilities? Obviously there are ranges of disabilities, and some things need to be properly supported, but by and large, there is no reason why the government should do less. In other words, we should be doing more to make sure that companies recognize that it isn't a case of somebody with disabilities now no longer being needed. It's a case of a balance of who's productive and who's not. And I think you'll find that therefore that will help hold people with disabilities in work, and they should, don't mind me saying so, maximize that effort through Disability Confident, which was a really good program.
Nick, I wonder if I could just ask you, with your sort of employer hat on, if you've any experience of this and how you found it.
Yes, I have, and I agree with Ian. I employ people because they're good, not because of anything else, because they can do a job, they can do it well, and they've got the right attitude. And I've took on many people at 16, 17, 18 years old, and I've turned many of them into tradesmen, office managers, secretary, all kinds of different work. And the one thing they've all got to have is the right attitude. And if they've got the right attitude, yeah, we can do wonders with them. And that's all that we want, just the right attitude, and I can do wonders with them.
Brilliant. I'm aware that time's winged chariot is increasingly against us. We have 4 or 5 minutes left. So there's one big question here that I'd like to put to all of you in turn. And it seems like it's quite a big shout, but what would be considered a defining act by government and industry that would protect and create jobs that has not yet been applied? So a defining act by government and industry that has not yet happened. I sort of see this as a bit of a roundup as well. You've got a minute each. I don't know who to throw under the bus first. Maybe should we start with Ian?
Well, there are a lot of different things that they can do, but the government needs to bear in mind that they don't create jobs. So what creates jobs is the private sector. Yes, public sector has jobs, and there are some creations in areas that they need, such as DWP may need extra people. But in truth, the big jobs miracle came from the private sector. And I think the way, therefore, as we come out of this, with people sadly falling unemployed, with some companies not being able to continue, the key thing is that we can do is to lower the cost of business in the short term. I mean, there's some talk about, well, we should raise taxes and we have to settle the deficit. The truth is right now, we will have to settle the deficit. But right now, the only way we will settle it in the medium term is to have our businesses functioning and people back to work. And I think, therefore, the truth is, right now, we will need to see a reduction in the business in areas of cost of business, such as taxation, rates, and also some of the onerous regulations. We need to have a holiday for a period on this. It's a bold gamble, but I would do it dramatically. I wouldn't mess around. I would make a dramatic move to say that companies that employ people will have their rates reduced, their taxes reduced, and many of them their regulations. This is critical right now, because otherwise we will lose those jobs and we'll lose the taxation, and therefore we will find it even more difficult to get the deficit down. Getting the deficit down is a long-term problem. Short term, let's get the economy moving.
Nick, same question to you.
I agree with what Ian has said there. I think we should make it as easy as possible for people to be employed. I believe in France they make it so onerous. That's why youth unemployment is huge in France, and it's not so over here. But anything that we can do to cut taxes and to make it easier for businesses to trade would be helpful. I don't think VAT. We always talk about cutting VAT, but I think if you're going to cut it, you need to cut it sizably. I think there's lots of different industries. I think maybe government could go through each of the different industries, see which ones are really struggling, and maybe do something bold there for a short period of time, like they have done with the hospitality industry.
Right. And Mercy, I suppose maybe a slightly tailored question for you, but is there anything that you see on your work on universal credit that could be particularly changed, tinkered or tailored to help going forward?
I think what needs to happen is education and reskilling needs to be much more integrated into the whole welfare process. Obviously the government has gone big on reskilling with this lifetime skills, and I think we basically need to tap into the big groups of people who have so much potential but just don't have the opportunities or the knowledge or the awareness about the careers that are available to them, and those are often the most disadvantaged people. So I definitely like to see people who are going into the welfare system coming out feeling like they have been given the advice and the knowledge and the awareness about and the skills to go and pursue a whole range of careers, because for me the economy that we're going to come out at the end of this with is going to look completely different, and there's going to be a lot of skills deficits like there already is in like STEM, for instance. And I'd like to really see people being reskilled so that the skills that we have, particularly for young people and young disadvantaged people, working class people, they can come out at the other end feeling like they are equipped to deal with whatever economy we will be faced with at the end of it. Thank
you. And lastly, Mims, what's your view on that as the government?
Well, I think we need to deliver on our plan for jobs. It's a £30 billion plan. It includes Kickstart. It includes the youth offer. We're working on new large-scale unemployment offer for people who perhaps maybe have been left behind, as we heard earlier. We've got to tackle that skills deficit. Jobs are not for life, it's a life of jobs. We've got to give people the confidence to take on those new skills, tackle some of those structural deficits, whether it's in the green sector or digital skills, care, agriculture. We can't disaggregate the international labour market and the UK labour market, so there's things to fix there. But I think it goes back to Ian's point as well, working with employers, working with business, and building that confidence to rebuild the economy, which ultimately creates those jobs and takes us back to that jobs miracle we were in before. But if we fix those structural deficits and give people that lifetime opportunity to reskill, be resilient, and be able to cope with something like this happening again, then we've really got the best out of what is a big challenge for government.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. I'm afraid time has now beaten us. Thank you very much to all our panelists for joining us, to Mercy, Nick, Ian, and especially Mims for substituting in at the last minute. And as I say, a game changer rather than a substitute, I think is what we'd like to see it as. And good luck for the months ahead. Thank you to everyone for tuning in. We have a couple more events tomorrow. If you see our Twitter feed, you'll see times, registration and subjects. So do have a look at that. Otherwise, it's been a really interesting conversation. I think we've only scratched the surface, but lots of work to do. So thank you all very much.